In case you haven't realized it by now, unlike other countries where history is made up by a series of important men and their deeds, in the case of Romania the main character of its history is the Romanian people itself. Still, there are a lot of important Romanian rulers with important achievements, some of which with decisive influences on European history, such as those who kept Islam at bay for a few centuries, when the Muslims were set on a global rampage, at the height of their conquest and atrocities, thus allowing Western Europe to prosper. It would take almost 1,000 years from the birth of Islam for Muslims to completely overrun Eastern Europe and threaten Western Europe. Throughout history the land of Romania was attacked by everyone who had some power in Europe, starting with the Greeks, the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Asian migratory hordes of the Dark Ages, and continuing with the Islamic empires, the Catholic world, the Austrian Empire, the Russian Empire, and ending with the people that controlled Western Europe in the modern era and today with the European Union. As such, a complete unity of Romanian speakers was never achieved. After the conquest of the Dacians by the Roman Empire, the Romanians were organized in small states or were not organized at all during the Dark Ages. In the Middle Ages the first proper Romanian states appear. In the south of today's Romania there was a state called Vlachia by foreigners and simply the Romanian country by the Romanians themselves. Together with Moldavia in the east, these two states would be the only ones of Eastern Europe that would endure up to the modern era, when they were united with the other main area inhabited by Romanian speakers that were still not assimilated, Transylvania. In the Balkans, the other group of Romanian speakers, the so-called Romanian Vlachs, preserved their identity and culture as well. In fact, in spite of the general chaos caused by the empires that tried to rule the Balkans, the Balkan Vlachs were always one of the most successful nations of the Balkans during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. In the 18th century they became so powerful that the Ottoman Empire was seeing them as the main threat of the Balkans, and as such an invasion of the main centers of Vlach culture was undertaken. The capital of the Balkan Vlachs of that era was the city of Moscow. This was the largest city of the Balkans. It had over 60,000 inhabitants in an era when Athens, for example, had only 10,000 inhabitants, of which only about 3,000 were Greeks. Moscow was surrounded by other Vlach cities that were also larger than Athens at that time, with more than 10,000 people, such as Grămoștea, Nicaea, Linca, etc. The only cities that rivaled Moscow were Western European cities and Constantinople, today's Istanbul, in the east. This was the most important cultural center of the Balkans, with its own banks and universities, and the only city of the Balkans apart from Constantinople that had a printing press, for example. It was obviously the main commercial center of Eastern Europe as well. Its riches and the fact that it was the most important Christian resistance center of the Balkans, with a concentration of over 70 churches, would unleash the envy and hatred of the Muslims and lead to its downfall. In 1769 the Ottomans started attacking the city. The attacks continued for 20 years until 1788, when the Albanian Muslim allies of the Ottomans overran the city and destroyed it almost completely, stealing everything they could. A large part of the survivors left the area occupied by the Albanian Muslims and spread out into Eastern Europe, while the elite of the Vlachs moved to Vienna and Budapest, the main cities of the Austrian Empire. The majority of the Balkan Vlachs have been forcefully assimilated since then in countries like Croatia, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, etc. We have already discussed some of the most important ancient leaders and we will discuss the more recent ones later, so next we will discuss a short list of important medieval leaders of the Romanian speakers, not necessarily in chronological order. One of the most successful leaders in European history was Stefan the Great of Moldova. For half a century, he single-handedly managed to stop the Islamic invasion of Europe at the Danube during the height of the Ottoman Empire, while being backstabbed by the Hungarian speakers and the Polish. He was so successful that even in the 20th century old people were preserving legends about him that were passed down to them by their forefathers. Called the Athlete of Christ, by Pope Sixtus IV, he transformed Moldavia into one of the most powerful states of Europe of the day, a state that could not be defeated although it was attacked by everyone around them, from the Polish and Hungarian kingdoms, to the Islamic Empire and the Tatar hordes. The fortresses he built or consolidated all around Moldova still stand today. Similarly, the dozens of beautiful monasteries he built are still standing today and are included in the UNESCO World Heritage List. Stefan the Great of Moldova fought 36 wars during his half-a-century reign. He only lost 2 of them, and even those were transformed into victories soon after. Moldavia was a small state compared to its neighbors, the Hungarian-speaking state, the Polish Kingdom and the Ottoman Empire. This is why in the majority of these battles the Romanians' odds were ridiculously small. For example, the Romanian king of Hungary Matthias Corvinus attacked Moldova with an army of 40,000 knights but was defeated and almost killed by Stefan the Great of Moldova, which had an army 4 times smaller and made up mostly of peasants. Another example is the giant attempt of invading Moldova by an Islamic army of 120,000 Muslims led by Suleiman the Magnificent, which was crushed by an army of 40,000 Romanians and 5,000 seculars from Transylvania. The entire army of the Ottoman Empire was slaughtered during the Battle of Vaslui, or as they tried to escape, resulting in the greatest victory Christianity ever had against Islam. 20 years later Stefan the Great of Moldova would crush a Polish army of 100,000 using again 40,000 Romanian peasants. Islam was started by a 7th century pedophile. So pedophilia became allowed in the cult of Islam, since the man who started it is supposed to have been sent by God. Thus the Muslims became history's biggest slave owners, including little boys and girls. From the Eastern European countries they were asking for thousands of little boys and girls to be sent to them annually as a tribute. One of the children that was held hostage by the Ottoman Muslim Empire would turn out to be Dracula. LOL. Vlad Tepes, to be more precise, the Romanian king who is the source of the Dracula story. He was a relative of Stefan the Great of Moldova we discussed earlier, and he too had to deal with the Muslim invasion of Europe, after he was released from Turkey and became the king of Wallachia. Much of the stories giving him a bad name come from the Saxons who occupied parts of Transylvania, and who described him as a cruel leader who prescribed all kinds of sadistic punishments. Vlad used to attack these Saxons often. What is known for sure is that he impaled criminals in his country and also the Muslims who attacked Romanian lands. That is where his name comes, Vlad the Impaler. He was known to be very strict with wrongdoers and unrighteous people. Legends say that the country was so safe that he placed a cup made of gold on the fountain for people to drink with, which was never stolen throughout his reign. He strengthened Wallachia economically and militarily until he was ready to rebel against the Ottoman Empire, who was asking for tribute from the Romanians and was at that time in its most powerful days, having just conquered Constantinople. He did this in an original way. Because the proud Muslims who were sent to ask for his submission would not take their hats off in front of the Romanian king, he nailed their turbans on their heads permanently. The Ottomans sent a huge army to punish the Romanians. Lonaco's Chaka Condiles wrote that the Muslim army numbered 250,000 soldiers, while the Turkish chronicler Tursunbeg placed it at 300,000. Abandoned by his Hungarian quote-unquote allies, Vlad harassed the Muslim army using his small army of 30,000 Romanians continually until the night of the 16th of June 1462, when he launched a night attack on the Muslims with the target being Muhammad the Conqueror himself. Vlad and his best Romanian soldiers disguised themselves as Muslims and entered the camp and slaughtered the elite of the Ottoman army. The attack was a success and the greatest sultan the Muslims ever had was forced to flee for his life. As the Muslims were running away, they came to the town of Targovist, where they were met with the famous forest of impaled Muslims, which convinced the sultan to head straight for Constantinople and abandon Wallachia. Vlad was betrayed by his brother who wanted to submit to the Ottomans, and so he was forced to leave to Transylvania, where he thought the Hungarians were his friends, but they too betrayed him and arrested him. The Hungarians only released him at the request of Stefan the Great of Moldova, who after the arrest of Vlad was left to defend Europe on his own. Vlad came back to the throne but was betrayed by the Hungarians again and arrested. He came to the throne for a third time, only to be assassinated by noblemen who sided with the Ottoman Empire, since Vlad was known to be an enemy of the nobility and a supporter of the average people and of free enterprise. Vlad the Impaler was the grandson of Mircea the Elder, one of the greatest Romanian rulers of the Middle Ages and among the first to fight against the Islamic invasion. History records him as a complete ruler, one that developed Wallachia and its economy and army, reformed the country and extended its borders to include neighboring lands inhabited by Romanians, and turned Wallachia into a rock that stood firm against the Muslim hordes. In 1389 the Serbian king Lazar called the entire Christendom to help defend Europe against Islam, but apart from the Romanian ruler almost nobody else was interested. At the Battle of Kosovo, the Europeans eventually lost, even though they managed to kill the Muslims' sultan himself. His son, Bayezid, climbed the throne after this battle and attempted an invasion of Wallachia to punish Mircea the Elder for helping the Serbians. The Romanians defeated the vanguard of the Islamic army but were overwhelmed in a second battle. forcing Mircea the Elder to abandon the throne. Called the bravest and wisest of Christian princes by the 16th century historian Johannes Leunclavius, he came back a few years later, and his reign was marked by a series of campaigns in the south of the Danube against the Ottomans, who were at that time attacked by the Mongols under Tamerlane. Another important king was Michael the Brave. He had a spectacular military career. Through a series of peace treaties and brilliant military victories, he managed to defeat pretty much everyone who had an interest in the lands of today's Romania. He tackled the Ottoman Empire, the Polish kingdom, and the Hungarians, who at that time did not have a country and were trying to rule Transylvania, and one by one defeated all of them. He was joined in his initial anti-Islamic revolt by the Christian Bosnians and by the Serbs, and later when he attacked the Hungarians, the peasants from Transylvania rebelled as well. At the height of his short career, he managed to unite most of the old Dacian kingdom in a single powerful state, for the first time after the Roman conquest of Dacia. His enemies called him Maleficus, meaning the evil Dacian, and his friends called him Restituta Daci, meaning the restorer of Dacia. He was tricked by the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, who first promised to help him against the Hungarians who wanted to take back Transylvania, but then betrayed him and ordered a mercenary to kill him when he least expected it. He became a famous man in Europe at that time, with some foreigners admiring his brilliant leadership skills, while others envied him and constantly tried to backstab him. The English ambassador to Constantinople, Edward Barton, wrote about his 1595 victory over the Ottoman Empire, the greatest force of that era in Europe, quote, "What so many emperors, kings and princes couldn't accomplish, was done by Michael, the smallest and poorest of kings, who defeated the armies of the great Sultan." The Ottoman chronicler Tahiri Ali Osman, writing about the same battle, described it as the judgment day for the Ottoman army. The imperial officer Heraclius Sota wrote to the Emperor Rudolf II in 1597 describing the determination of Michael the Brave to cross the Danube and liberate Bulgaria, from where the Christians were asking for his help, and which at that time still had a large Romanian community. Perhaps the greatest achievement of this man was to unite the simple people from all Christian nations of Eastern Europe under one goal: the expulsion of Islam from Europe. The records of the day show that not only the subjugated Bulgarians, Serbs, Bosnians and other Balkan people joined his army, but also Saxons and Seculars from Transylvania, Romanian peasants from all corners of the land, etc. He admitted numerous times that the reason why he started his endeavors was to defend Christianity. Romanian history is also full of anonymous peasants who rose to lead revolutions. Being occupied by so many foreign powers for such a long time, there are few countries in the world, if any, that have such a high number of revolts and rebellions, starting with the Dacian revolts against the Roman occupiers, and ending with the modern anti-communist revolutions. One such revolt was the Transylvanian revolt of the Romanian peasants against the Austrian Empire, who at that time was trying to convert the Romanians into Hungarian-speaking Catholics and was treating the Romanian peasants like slaves and destroying their Orthodox churches. Set in a time when Freemasonic revolutions were taking place all over the world and initially started as a rebellion against the Hungarian-speaking nobility that oppressed them for centuries, it became a proper war against the Austrian Empire when it tried to suppress the revolt by force, and ended up as a war for the national liberation of Transylvania, with the leader of the revolution being called Rex Daci, or the King of Dacia in the Austrian painted Chronicle of Vienna. He, a simple peasant, was received many times by the Austrian Emperor, something which few people of the era could manage. His revolution made the headlines of European newspapers for years. This man was called Hora. His peasant army liberated the mountains of Transylvania from the Habsburgs and headed into the plains, to liberate the rest of the Romanians. Romanians from all classes joined the rebellion, from serfs to public officers to soldiers of the Austrian army. After a series of spectacular victories of the peasant army against the Imperial Austrian army, the leaders of the revolution were betrayed by a group of companions who were caught and were threatened with torture and reprisals against their families. The traitors were also influenced by the Orthodox priests who were being persecuted in that era and were afraid of the reprisals of the Austrians, so betrayed the revolution. The Austrians made a spectacle of the execution of the Romanian leaders, who were executed using the breaking wheel, a slow and painful death. To avoid future revolts and embarrassments, the Austrian emperor would later abolish serfdom, or slavery. Baron von Praes described serfdom to the emperor in 1778, quote, "The nobility considered the Romanian a man born to be their slave, whose only happiness should be the fact that he is allowed to breathe.